Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. We are joined once again by Christopher Tomaszewski. I practiced getting that right this time. And Chris, last time you came on the podcast, you broke the record, my friend. We spoke for almost 4 hours on the work you've been doing regarding the immateriality and immortality of the human soul. It was one of my favorite conversations. It was an absolute blast. By the time people hear this, I suspect they will have heard that, and I hope that they are just hungering for more. And we teased that we are going to talk about divine simplicity, what divine simplicity is, and how to overcome the standard objections against it, and maybe some of the less common objections as well. We're going to spend, I think, a good amount of time on this. So, Chris, before we begin, if you wouldn't mind just kind of providing a brief reintroduction of who you are and what you do, and
Sure.
then any preliminary remarks.
I am a rising sixth year PhD student at Baylor, and my work focuses mostly on metaphysics, medieval philosophy, contemporary philosophy, religion, and especially the intersection of various problems in contemporary philosophy of religion and what I think Aquinas' answer to problems like that would be. And in particular, my dissertation is on the survival of the soul and the non-survival of the human person in the interim state. People can see the last podcast we did together that you mentioned about that. I think I agree. That was really exciting stuff. I really enjoyed it. And lately, I've been getting heavily into defending divine simplicity and classical theism more broadly. So I have one publication about this in analysis, and I've been having a lot of fun talking to people like yourself on various podcasts about it, and I'm happy to try to help Catholics and other classical theist friendly Christians understand how to defend it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I know we're going to get into the technical weeds in this conversation, but I would like to at least make it initially accessible for people who might not be familiar with this entire debate. So can you help us to understand on just sort of a basic level what divine simplicity is? And then, Chris, here's something that I think doesn't often get brought up enough in some of the debates. Maybe say a few words about what you think the upshot or the advantages of divine simplicity are in terms of explanatory power, morality, anything else, because I think that's sometimes overlooked. To me, it seems to come with a lot of advantages, and those are worth considering before we move forward.
Right. So let's see. I'll give maybe like the very simple explanation, the slightly more detailed explanation, and the most detailed explanation.
Love it.
So the simplest way of putting divine simplicity, as the name suggests, right, is that it's the doctrine that God has no parts. Mm-hmm. Now, where the doctrine tends to get controversial and runs into prima facie difficulties is how you decide what counts as parts. And the people who originally crafted what is now called the classical theist tradition, people like Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Plotinus, and culminating with St. Thomas Aquinas and so on, thought about parts in their metaphysics a lot differently than we think about parts. And the way I like to actually explain this is something that is usually familiar to people just getting into scholastic philosophy in general, is that they'll note that the concept of cause has undergone a significant narrowing throughout philosophical history. The scholastics had a far more expansive, far richer notion of causation than we now do, right? So they had at least four major kinds of causes that they recognize: material causes, formal causes, efficient causes, and final causes. Nowadays, it's outside of philosophical circles, circles of people who are familiar, at least with the broad strokes of the Aristotelian and scholastic philosophical traditions. it's very rare to hear anybody talk about causation that way, right? They just talk about causes. And, you go into a US courtroom or whatever, and cause is often a subject matter talked about in court. And they talk about different causes sometimes, different kinds of causes, but they don't talk about it that way. And outside of courtrooms, it's even more narrow, right? People just talk about one thing causing another usually without any further specification whatsoever. And usually what they're talking about is what the scholastics were talking about when they talked about efficient causes, right? So I knock the glass off the table, it falls and shatters. I am the efficient cause of the shattering. There's also other kinds of causation, material, formal, final, that the scholastics recognized. And for reasons that, we won't go into all right here, see Edward Fraser's work for full development of this.
Mm-hmm.
Those other concepts of causation, those other parts of the full Aristotelian and scholastic idea of causation dropped away in the light of the scientific revolution, mostly, and the philosophical developments that followed upon it. And so, yeah, like I said, this is probably old hat to those of your listeners who even have a cursory familiarity with the Aristotelian or scholastic traditions. But parthood has had a similar narrowing in its conceptual content through
mm-hmm.
philosophical history, right? So the way we tend to think about parts now is in terms of what the medieval Aristotelians would have called integral or material parts, right? I have a table and it has a flat surface on top. That's one part, and it has 4 legs. Those are other parts, and those are parts in the Aristotelian or Thomistic sense as well.
Yes.
But in Aristotle or Aquinas would have also recognized as parts, at least arguably, the accidents of a thing, the nature of a thing, the essence and existence of a thing. And even though we still talk about the natures of things, the properties or accidents of things, the essences or existences of things, we no longer talk about them so much as parts.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, right. So when you start to, but if you do think of them as parts, then the doctrine of divine simplicity entails that in God, all these things are one, right? So God doesn't have any form, matter, composition. He's not a body, right? Like I am, or like a rock is, or like a dog is. And he's similar to angels in that respect, right? Mm-hmm. Angels are also not bodies. But he's also, different from, but he's even simpler than angels, right? So there's no distinction, for example, between God and his nature. Or to use a bit of scholastic terminology, between God's nature and his supposit. So the thing that God is identical to the nature that God has.
Mm-hmm. Which, for people who are new to this would prevent God from being susceptible to multiplication, right? This safeguards not just, really it safeguards God's absolute uniqueness and aseity.
Right. So I was going to save that little bit for. I'll elaborate a little bit more on that when we talk about the upshot.
Cool.
And then it implies, right, there's no distinction in God between subject and accident. So it's not as if God is a being who has mercy, right? For example, we say God is merciful, but when we say that, we do not mean that God is a being who has the accident or property of being merciful. We mean that God is mercy. Mm-hmm. Or when we say God is good, we don't mean that God is a subject in which the accident or property of goodness inheres. We mean that God is goodness. Mm-hmm. And so on for every attribute of God, right? His God is his knowledge, God is his power, and so on. Finally, right, we don't make a distinction between God's essence and his existence. God is that he is, which sounds very weird to the contemporary philosophical ear. But that is a crucial part of the doctrine of divine simplicity, at least for Aquinas. He hinges one of his most important proofs of the existence of God in his De Ante et Essentia on the fact that this distinction disappears in God. And in this way, he's unique, right? Even angels have their essences distinct from their existence. But it's in God alone that essence and existence are identified. Right. So then this is what, so one way of recapitulating, let's say this first. One way of recapitulating all of that is to say that anything that is in God is God. Mm-hmm. That's perhaps maybe a more direct, more accessible way of stating the point for contemporary listeners than just saying God has no parts, right? Because you might wonder, well, I mean, there's lots of things that I think might be intrinsic to a thing, but I wouldn't call parts. Whereas, people in the scholastic tradition would. So an easier way to put it that makes the point perhaps more accessible is to just say anything that is in God is God. Mm-hmm. Right, so that's basically the doctrine. Right, you asked me for the upshot.
Yeah. Well, now real quick, for Catholics especially, sure. how much weight does this doctrine have? You want to go into that now?
Yeah, it's a dogma. It's de fide. You're a heretic if you deny it. Now, of course, the question is, now there's some legitimate, I think, discussion to be had among dogmatic theologians as to just how many of the implications that Aquinas took to flow from divine simplicity are part of the dogma. So the dogma, as defined by Vatican I, right, is that God is absolutely simple. But one could arguably quibble with, well, how simple is absolutely simple, right? I mean, it'll depend on what you read. So, I mean, one way I've seen philosophers who are maybe not so thrilled with Aquinas's account of divine simplicity talk about this is to say, well, yeah, I'm Catholic. I accept that God is absolutely simple. It's just that I don't count things like accidents or essence or existence, etc., as parts. So I can accept what Vatican I says about divine simplicity and just reject, Thomas's version of divine simplicity because I disagree with Thomas about what counts as a part. That's just a metaphysical dispute. I'm not the magisterium, so far be it from me to condemn that. But my personal opinion on it is that, following, especially following encyclicals like Pascendi, for example, that condemns modernism, it's important to read dogmas in light of the way that the fathers who defined the dogma, in this case, the fathers of Vatican I or earlier councils that had defined divine simplicity, would have understood the terms. And I think it's really straining credulity to think that they didn't have something broadly like Aquinas's account in mind when they did this, especially when, at Vatican I, every bishop at Vatican I was very friendly to Thomism. These weren't anti-Thomist bishops who wanted to leave stuff like this wide open for debate. I mean, they definitely didn't intend to dogmatize Aquinas' version, but when they say that God is absolutely simple, I mean, the most natural reading of that is to say, well, they had something like a scholastic metaphysics in the background to define what they meant by simple. And you got to be really careful about this, right? Because if you follow this kind of if you try to get clever with this kind of thing and just say, well, I accept that God is absolutely simple. I just don't want to count as parts any of the things that have traditionally been counted as parts in the scholastic tradition, and therefore, my doctrine of God is going to look very different, even though I agree with the dogma that God is absolutely simple. Mm-hmm. You have to ask yourself, well, what exactly is supposed to be your retort to the people who say things like, well, I accept the doctrine of the resurrection. By resurrection, I mean that Jesus lived on in the memories of the apostles and other disciples and stuff like that.
Right, or as just a spiritual resurrection, but not a bodily resurrection. Yeah, you start playing the game, it might come back to bite you. Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, in the case of the resurrection isn't the greatest example, because the church actually has come out and further clarified we mean a bodily resurrection and so on. But the point is, you can, no matter how much follow-up clarification you get from the magisterium, you can always still play some kind of word game with it. And that's kind of what Pius X was dealing with the modernists, right? And part of what gets condemned in his encyclical Pascendi in 1907 is the very idea that you can play these kind of word games, right? So I don't have the text in front of me, so I'm just very loosely paraphrasing, but he says, right, you have to retain the meaning of a dogma as once laid down, with no rescission from that meaning in the specious name of a deeper understanding. So, right, the very idea that you can keep playing these kind of games of, well, I understand the terms this way, ends up getting condemned itself. So, I think there's an invitation there in a way to sentire cum ecclesia, think with the church,
right? Not
just to assent to the texts, the words on the page, but to understand, well, what is the philosophical tradition underlying the relevant dogmas? And to what extent did the church take herself to be adopting that philosophical tradition as a handmaid to her theological definitions? And,
right. Yeah. No, that's very helpful. So cool. Thanks for entertaining that. Now let's get back to the upshots. What are the advantages of divine simplicity?
Right. So I guess the best way of answering that question is to begin by noting, okay, well, where does divine simplicity come from?
That's right. What's motivating this? Why did we even get here in the first place? Good suggestion. Mm-hmm.
Where's the commitment coming from? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So as the name suggests, right, classical theism, of which divine simplicity is the crown jewel doctrine, if you will, the one that gets rejected by almost everybody who rejects classical theism, and the one that gets accepted by almost everybody who accepts classical theism. The tradition of classical theism, right, goes all the way back to Plato, right, to this identification of the deity with the form of the good, with goodness itself. And I guess probably the easiest way to explain this is, right, that the way that Plato and his philosophical successors were thinking about the project of natural theology was not the way that most contemporary philosophers of religion think about philosophy of religion, right? In contemporary philosophy of religion, it's mostly Christian philosophers who are taking the revealed truths of Christianity and attempting to defend them against charges of incoherence from secular philosophers. And that's a very important, worthwhile project. But we have to remember that people like Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus and even Augustine didn't think that was what they were doing when they were doing what they would call natural theology, or what Aquinas at least would call natural theology, where they were starting off with, they weren't starting off with a revelation. Certainly Plato and Aristotle weren't. Not a Christian revelation, to be sure. And of course, they were completely ignorant of the Jewish revelation. They were thinking, right, about God in terms of a broader metaphysical project of explanation. I have a world around me. I want to explain where it all came from. I want to explain why it's the way it is, and so on. And a series of philosophical reasons in an attempt to accomplish that explanation leads me to posit the existence of a being that is devoid of matter, knows everything, is infinitely powerful, et cetera, and is absolutely simple.
Right.
Now, in the Aristotelian tradition, right, that absolute simplicity comes from the fact that God is going to have to be purely actual, right? So there has to be no composition of act and potency in God, because everything that's a composite of act and potency is in potency with respect to something else that is capable of moving it, changing it. And so that thing can't be God, right? I mean, that's not going to be your ultimate source of explanation. And that's what you're after if you're Aristotle, right?
Right, because just because no potency can bring itself to act. So whenever we have that type of act potency composition, there has to be a more fundamental actuality to explain how that potency is even a potency, right? If it can be actualized, there has to be some more fundamental actuality. Right. So Chris, you said something on a previous conversation that really struck with me, and I want to, that stuck with me, I should say, which struck me as well, that I think it was with Swan, our good friend Swan. And you said that the difference is kind of this, right? That there's a lot of modern day apologetics out there that starts with some biblical data or some aspect of revelation and then kind of defending it against contemporary objections. Fine project, cool project, very important in many regards. I don't think either of us are disparaging that. Yeah. However, there's another tradition, which we're talking about, that is really saying, hey, revelation, wonderful. It's great. Certainly we affirm revelation as Catholics, that's our faith, right? But there's also this project of just searching for ultimate explanations, of trying to understand really everything about everything, as Bernard Lonergan would put it. And the reason this struck me is because, before I became Catholic, what attracted me about classical theism and divine simplicity was the fact that it seemed to remove bruteness from the world in a way that monopolytheism, as David Bentley Hart calls it, or theistic personalism does not. It allows some bruteness into the world. So while, sometimes people, and I'm sure you'll talk about this, who critique theistic personalism, and we'll talk about what that is as well, say that it's kind of like a souped up Zeus, right? It's okay. There's a little bit of rhetoric there. We don't really think that they think of God as just like a really super powerful, gentlemanly figure, right? Like they still hold immaterial or whatever. But however, there is going to be, in principle, some bruteness that is left unexplained on this account of God. And the reason that I think a lot of classical theists say that this essentially concedes atheism, which is a very strong claim, is because once you let in a little bit of bruteness, you let in all the bruteness. Right. And the reason this really struck me when you said this is because I think part of the reason I became Catholic is because I think I realized this, that the only way I'm going to secure the theistic tradition is through divine simplicity. And I have every good reason to affirm that, because I think the best arguments give you divine simplicity. And then that gives you a God that can account for necessity, which is the thing, like it can give a deeper metaphysical reason for the principle of sufficient reason, right? Of why God is a necessary being. Rather than just saying that God is a necessary being, simplicity can explain why God is a necessary being. Right. And it shuts off brute facts, right? In the sense that God is that unrestricted act of understanding itself, as Bernard Lonergan would put it, that God is the complete set of answers to the complete set of questions that can coherently be asked about reality. Even if we can't access that, we can know in principle that is God with divine simplicity. And to me, that was the biggest upshot that I think doesn't often get appreciated enough in this debate. and the danger of just letting in even a teensy little bit of bruteness wherever that is. I don't think that's drilled enough, because for me, when I was weighing atheism and theism, that was a huge thing for me, right? If there was going to be any bruteness in it all, I don't think I would have been able to make the commitment, honestly.
Yeah. So, right. I mean, you said a lot of great things there that I think some of which I was going to try to hit on myself. You reminded me, talking about the Bernard Lonergan quote, of something that Wilfrid Sellars, 20th century, as far as I know, non-Christian philosopher, said about what the aim of philosophy is. You know, he said it's to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good way to characterize, you know, what Aristotle is certainly up to, right? I mean, whatever else he's doing, he's definitely not incorporating, you know, a Judeo-Christian revelation into his philosophy and working forward from there. Right, he's taking the world as he sees it around him and trying to work back from that. Now, what's beautiful about the Judeo-Christian theological tradition and Aristotle's philosophical tradition, and this is why Aquinas ends up being so important to the Catholic and I think more broadly Christian tradition, is that he's the point where these two projects end up meeting. And we find out that they're in fact very compatible, contra lots of critics of classical theism. So if you want to know, well, why are Catholics so obsessed with St. Thomas Aquinas, or why are Christians more broadly so interested in his work? It's because he shows us a really deep, really important, really beautiful truth, namely that philosophers working without the aid of revelation in Greece and working backwards from the world to what God must be like, arrive at truths that meet up very well and are highly compatible with and complementary to truths that God reveals about himself to Jews and Christians, a divine self-revelation, and these go together, end up going together very well, right? And it's Aquinas who shows us that. You know, prior to Aquinas, there was a lot of skepticism about Aristotle's tradition and whether it was in fact compatible with Christianity. And you know, whenever you find that, it's also a great confirmation that both theories are right? I mean, if I'm working independently from you and I'm working in a different way than you, using completely different methods, and we both arrive at the same basic kinds of answers about what God must be like, that increases the probability that we're both right. And so this is part of why Aquinas is celebrated so much as much as he is in the Catholic tradition and the Christian tradition more broadly, is because he shows that, you know, what Aristotle's doing on his own, working backward from creation to God, complements perfectly or almost perfectly what Jews and Christians are getting from God himself, and working forward, so to speak, about, well, what creation must be like if this is what God tells us about himself. And it's also a very beautiful thing, right? I mean, you almost kind of see, I think, the hand of providence in that, right? That there's a certain way that God wanted to disclose himself to Jews in Israel, you know, at the same time that Greeks in Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle are working on answering very similar questions over in Greece. And it, of course, just to say that they're doing natural theology is not to exclude the possibility that they're doing natural theology as guided by providence.
Yeah, and that's another thing that sort of struck me too, and then really made me consider Christianity and Catholicism, is to see that convergence, right, of working through these metaphysical demonstrations for God, as God being the conclusion of really a greater systematic metaphysical project, and absolutely simple God being that conclusion, and then seeing how that meshed with certain aspects of revelation, the biblical data, famously when God reveals his name in Exodus. And I know there's debate about that interpretation, but
Sure.
I think it does lend support to divine simplicity. Or even in the New Testament, when we hear that within God there is no shadow of change, or things like this.
Or when we hear in First John that God is love. I mean, I don't think there's any controversy about that interpretation. If there is, it's brand new controversy. I mean, the tradition, I think, about the interpretation of First John when he tells us that God is love, I think, as far as I'm aware, is absolutely unanimous that this is an identification that's being made between God and charity, agape. Whatever you say about Exodus 3:16, I don't think there's any way to get out of the identification of God with love in John 1.
Right, and then that itself, I think, should add more epistemic weight to how you look at Exodus.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it might color. Well, I mean, it shows us that God is, in fact, I think, one of the things God is doing in Scripture is actually disclosing some of the metaphysical theory about what he's like at this level, because the Exodus 3:16 usually gets dismissed as like, well, God's not really trying to reveal the metaphysics of his nature. He's just trying to teach the Israelites something about his faithfulness, that he's constant and doesn't change and doesn't change his mind about his promises and so forth. Or at least that not Exodus 3:16, parts of Scripture where it says that God doesn't change. But there's no getting around the First John identification, as far as I can see, and I haven't seen anybody even try to explain that in any other way. And it's worth noting that as well, because I think it gets you over one of the hardest parts of divine simplicity, namely the identification of God with his action. That's one of the parts of divine simplicity that I think strikes the contemporary ear the hardest, or the oddest, perhaps, and that opponents of classical theism tend to object to the most. We'll talk in a little bit about modal collapse and so forth. But if it's right there in First John, then there's no getting around it. And if you have to accept that God is identical to what God does, then there's really not much point left in objecting to the less controversial aspects of the doctrine of divine simplicity. Mm-hmm. I do want to say, it's also to agree with you about bruteness. I think that is the crucial part. Because, as you noted, you can't have just a little bruteness in your metaphysics. If you let some bruteness in, you let a bunch of bruteness in more than just one way, too. So one way, this is important because you often see philosophers today say things like, look, everybody has something that's brute. It's just, you got to choose what's going to be brute. And I think this is even people who are friendly to classical theism, I think, I've heard say things like this, like everybody has something brute, as if it's unavoidable.
Correct.
And this is, I think, a huge mistake. And the reason why it's a huge mistake is twofold. Firstly, because if you put something right at the beginning of your causal explanation of everything, that it ends up being brute, then you haven't really explained anything further on down the causal line, right? So
right. The bruteness just carries forward. Mm-hmm.
All right, and you say, well, where did I come from? I was like, oh, my parents. Where'd they come from? Their parents. Where'd they come from? Their parents. And you keep asking this question, and I say, okay, well, where'd their parents come from? And or you ask me where'd their parents come from, and I say, it's brute. Well, then everything I said up to that point, I might as well have not said. I might as well have just skipped that, right? I mean, because that wasn't really doing any explanatory work, because it isn't ultimately tracing back to something that needs no further explanation.
Right. It's a borrowed explanation that never gets cashed out.
Right. So, I mean, because if that kind of thing is okay, then I can explain everything, right? I mean, in theory, I can explain everything, right? You say, well, what about all the UFOs? All the UFO appearances that have ever occurred. Well, I can say they're all optical illusions. And you say, well, what was the source of the light? How was the optical illusion produced? And I say, well, the illusions are brute.
It's just brute,
right?
Yeah. Right.
I mean, nobody's going to accept that, right? And what you're going to say to me, right, is well, no, you actually haven't explained. You're not going to say, oh, well, you explained all the UFO appearances, but but then the optical illusions themselves didn't receive any further explanation. You're going to say, no, you didn't even explain the UFO appearances, mm-hmm. right? Because you explained it in terms of something which itself has no explanation. Now, it's true that, when we're not engaged in metaphysical theory of everything, in everyday life, we do tend to explain things in a summary kind of way, right? We only give the proximate explanation because it would be very tedious to.
My conversations with my kids would never end.
Right. Every conversation.
Or sometimes we do just give the ultimate explanation. God, Dad, why do lions exist? God, right?
Right. Yeah, sometimes, right. So, but every conversation, a conversation that appealed to explanation, even between adults, would be reduced to this childlike game of, well, what explains that and so forth. We kind of just operate on the assumption that, like, well, if I just give you the proximate explanation, you can then figure out the rest from there, given the background metaphysical theory. But in the ontology room, in the metaphysics room, we are in the business of giving ultimate explanations that go all the way back and that leave no explanatory stone unturned, so to speak, leave no fact brute, or at least. And when I say leave no fact brute, I want to say there, what I mean is leave all the simple or atomic facts brute. Let's put it that way, because I think part of my work on simplicity has I think shown me that there's going to be some comparative facts. Like, well, why X rather than Y? Like, you've explained X, but you haven't told me why X rather than Y. Actually do end up going without ultimate explanation. And I think that's just, that's fine. Everybody's going to have to accept that. There's no getting around it. But you do want to be able to at least answer the question, why X, even if you can't answer why X rather than Y.
Right. And how much, let me ask you a question here. So I guess when we probably should have defined brute as well. So I'll let you do that in a minute. But there's something being brute in principle, and there's something just that we just don't have epistemic access to, right? So I think that it's important to draw those distinctions. Like, we can say, following Lonergan, that God has to be given our metaphysical project the complete set of answers to the complete set of questions that can be coherently asked, right? But that doesn't mean that we can just tap into that we're going to be able to. And in fact, we have reasons to think that we wouldn't be able to just tap into that. Right. And then in terms of explanation of how thick, I guess, an explanation has to be to satisfy something like the PSR, like how much mystery does it have to remove is another important element. So go into as much of that as you think is needed for this conversation, but that I know that itself could be a whole different
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, so by brute, we just mean unexplained. And as you alluded to earlier, the sense of explanation we're appealing to when we talk about unexplained facts, brute facts, is not the epistemic sense, because in that case, there's a whole lot of bruteness, and there's some that we're never even going to be able to do anything about this side of the beatific vision. And so we're not talking about, well, has it been explained in such a way that I personally understand it? We're just asking the metaphysical question, is it susceptible of explanation? And if so, what kind of thing would do the explanatory work? And whatever the explanation ends up being, right? So will we say something like, there's some kind of explanation for particle wave duality in quantum mechanics, for example. I'm not a physicist, so maybe we do have some kind of more fundamental explanation for that. But even if we didn't, on hand, right, we want to at least have in our metaphysical theory something that says that there's going to be something that ends up explaining that, even if we don't know what it is. There's going to be something that makes it possible for there to be an explanation in the epistemic sense.
Well,
right?
it's funny that you actually bring that up, because Father Spitzer, on his work with divine,
I might have lost you there, Pat.
Still, let me know when you can hear me again, Chris.
Oh, yep, got you back.
Okay, cool.
Sorry.
Yeah, I said it was funny that you brought that up, because Spitzer, in his work on divine simplicity, he argues for this model of ontological simplicity and compatibility between, states of affairs, right? That to have compatibility ultimately between restricted states of affairs, you're going to need something that's absolutely simple. And he says, actually, contemporary physics gives us kind of a contemporary example of what used to be known as the hierarchy of being, where light can be an ontologically can be a simple enough reality that sometimes it can take on the boundaries of a particle or boundaries of a wave without committing us to the absurdity of a wavicle, for example. So it's funny you bring that up, because
Right.
Spitzer kind of uses that to drive to the ultimate form of simplicity, to ground how there can be restricted realities at all. Anyway, that's a side point. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm not familiar with that work, but that sounds interesting, and perhaps a good complement to things I've been saying about explanation by appeal to the divine. Let me say, where was I? I'm sorry.
So we were still talking about brute,
right.
epistemic versus metaphysical.
Oh, right. So what we're after, I guess, in terms of, metaphysical explanation, right? The kind of explanation that answers to the PSR is, answers to the question, well, what makes this thing intelligible, right? Even if it's not something that is actually understood by me or by any other human person, right? We're after intelligibility, not necessarily whether I or any other human person actually has that intellectual explanation in my own head. It's just that it's there, in principle, available to be discovered by any agent who has the intellectual wherewithal to receive the explanation. And some of those things like the Trinity or whatever, right, are going to be things that perhaps we don't even if God tried to explain it to us in full detail, we might not have the intellectual wherewithal on this side of the resurrection without the aid of grace, to receive the explanation. Right? It might be pointless for God to even try to give us that explanation, but there is one, right? And that's what we're committed to in virtue of being committed to PSR. I should also note, coming back to the bruteness fact, I explained one way in which letting a little bit of bruteness into your system brings a whole lot of bruteness, namely that it leaves all the explanatorily downstream facts unexplained. But it also leaves you defenseless against your ideological opponents who may choose some other brute fact, right? So if I appeal to God, right, and I start saying that certain things about God are brute, and in virtue of those brute facts, the world is the way that it is, then there's I lose I lose my sword against the atheist who wants to say that some purely natural fact is the brute fact that explains everything else.
Right. And that's so you really do open yourself up to the very common objection of, well, what caused God? Or if God needs a cause, then, or if, that if we're going to have no kind of principled stopping point at God, we might as well just stop at the universe or something like that. Right. Mm-hmm.
As long as you're willing to allow bruteness, you're not only not explaining all the downstream stuff, you're opening the door to your opponents choosing some other equally good brute fact from which to launch their explanation of the world. And you're going to have no way whatsoever of objecting to it, because by your own admission, your fact is brute, which is to say it's as good as any other, right? Mm-hmm. It's no better or worse than any other fact that you could substitute for it that would be equally brute.
Right. So that's interesting. If we can jam on that for a minute, because then I'm trying to think, like somebody like Swinburne might say, and I don't know what his position is right now, but I mean, he's fairly well known for like holding that God is just a brute contingent, right? And then he would try and say, well, he's still a simpler explanation than, say, a collection of fundamental physical simples or something like that. But then it seems like if you still let in any brute, and I think Proust would probably say this, then you're going to lose probabilistic reasoning with it, right? Yeah. So you would probably even lose that defense, wouldn't you? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, so maybe you can just say that, the simplicity of your theory is a fundamental desideratum for all theories. But the thing is, if all the brute explanations of the universe are on the table, right? All the brute facts we could posit that would explain the empirical data are all on the table. I mean, prima facie, at least, it seems extremely unlikely that there are no purely natural explanations that are as simple or even simpler than Swinburne's God, for example. So if simplicity is all you got, well, I'll just choose a purely natural explanation that ends up being simpler than makes my theory simpler than Swinburne's theory. And you can, right, and then you can try to dispute how simple my theory is, but you can't dispute, you can't blame me for having put a brute fact at the origin of my explanatory story for everything, because you're doing the same.
Right. Yeah. No, that's interesting. I want to think a little bit more on that, because I know, sometimes I guess the defense would be to try and say, well, it is simpler, so it's more probable. But I would kind of want to push back and say, well, I think we might have an epistemic catastrophe if we let bruteness in, to the point that we might not even be able to make probability assessments anymore. We can just leave that open-ended. We don't have to try and close that one off. But no, I see. Go ahead.
I think that's absolutely right. So when we're making probability, to come back to that point, when we're making probability judgments, those are being driven by our explanatory expectations, right? So if I look out and I see that the ground is wet today outside, I judge that it's likely to be so because it rained, due to the way I have structured in my mind all the possible explanations with probability weightings on each of them for what could explain the rain, the ground outside being wet. But once you let in brute facts, right, then that's going to disrupt that whole probability calculus. I no longer have any reason to think, it's very likely that the ground is wet because it rained, if there could be brute explanations of brute facts that explain why the ground is wet. Because, who knows how likely those are? I can know how likely it is to have rained, because that itself has some further explanation that I can then base a probability judgment off of, and go on back until we reach necessities. But if you say that there might be brute contingent facts that explain why the ground is wet. Well, now I have no way of weighing how likely that is versus rain or versus some kid playing with a hose or whatever. And so I have no way of knowing what the true probability is of each of the explanations.
Right. Yeah. So even just running with probabilities at least seems to have an implicit commitment to intelligibility.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's good stuff. That's interesting. And so I guess the deeper upshot we're getting here is that simplicity gives us a solid foundation for the PSR. Right. That's really, I think, what we're getting at in respect.
I don't know if I want to use the word foundation. I mean, I think that, well, the PSR, I want to say that the PSR is what leads us to divine simplicity, right? This thirst for explanation and for truth that gets cashed out philosophically in terms of something like the PSR,
right.
Ultimately leads us to the conclusion that God must be purely actual, and because purely actual, absolutely simple.
Right. So yeah, let me think of that for a minute, because I think when I think like PSR, I think like Leibniz and Clarke traditionally, right, as opposed to the Thomistic PSR. Because I think if you're using the Thomistic PSR, then you're going to get the pure actuality. You're right there. But if you're just coming from like a classic Leibnizian view, you just get to a necessary being, right? But then what's the deeper explanation of why that being is necessary? Well, then divine simplicity, and then we have support of that version of the PSR, if that makes sense, right?
Right. Okay. So, I mean, one thing you mentioned that I think is absolutely right is that even necessary things sometimes call out for explanation.
Right.
So, I mean, I think one thing you often hear a lot of opponents of classical theism say is, well, look, it's already baked into my doctrine of God that he's a necessary being. And so I don't need any further explanation about why God exists. And I think this is a huge mistake, right? I mean, for two reasons. One is because that's just not how necessity works, right? And necessity doesn't provide explanations. Saying that something that calls out for explanation is necessary doesn't end the call for explanation.
And just think about that. Like, who wouldn't just continue to scratch your head at that point?
Right. I mean,
certainly I would. Right.
If anything, in most cases, it's going to make the call for explanation more pressing. It's going to make the call for explanation louder, because now you're not just telling me that it's the case. You're telling me it's necessarily the case. That's a stronger fact, and in general, stronger facts call out for more explanation. The other reason you don't want to do this, right, is because, again, right, I mean, if you're facing an atheist who is comfortable making some kind of natural fact necessary, he or she will then be in the position of being able to say the same thing. Well, look, it's already baked into my metaphysical theory that, whatever the fundamental natural fact is that caused the Big Bang, that thing is necessary. And that ends all the calls for explanation. You don't want to do that, right? If you're a theist, you don't want to do that. And at any rate, I mean, I think it's just obviously a mistake to think that saying that something is necessary puts an end to calls for explanation of that thing.
Right. Yeah. But if you're coming from the classical tradition, where you're starting from the act potency distinction and you get to pure actuality, you're just going to get necessity as a byproduct of that.
Right. You end up coming to the conclusion that God necessarily exists in order for him to do the explanatory work that you want him to do in this world, right? With respect to the things that actually exist, you find out, well, he ends up being the explanation for anything that could exist.
Right. Yeah. And then you have a principled stopping point, right?
Right.
What caused God just doesn't really make any sense, since God has nothing to be caused in virtue of being purely actual. Right?
And not only that, but given that his essence is identical to his existence, there's not even in principle anything that could have caused him. And even without a cause, right, you might think even some uncaused things need some explanations. Well, like why is it that they can exist uncaused, right? And with divine simplicity, you get that. Well, it's because this thing exists essentially, right? God, it's his essence to exist.
Right. And I think it is important to say that God can be uncaused, but that doesn't mean he's lacking an explanation. God has an explanation. And I think sometimes people just conflate the two, right?
That's right. Yeah. So you get, and that's important, right? We're not saying that God is the one sole brute fact that we're letting into our system. We're letting no brute facts into the system, and God's existence isn't brute precisely because it's of God's essence to exist, right? So one way to think about this, right? There's two ways you explain why something exists. You can explain it externally, right? And that's usually a causal explanation. We say, well, something external caused this thing to exist. Or you can explain it internally, right? There's something about the nature of the thing that makes it such as to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we find in God, right? It's of the nature of God that his essence is identical to his existence and that he must therefore exist. And that is our explanation of why God exists. And right, that's the last sentence, so to speak, in the book of explanation of everything, right?
Yeah, that's cool. So just to summarize the points real quick, that this is not some arbitrary stipulation of the Catholic Church, divine simplicity, right? This comes out from many great metaphysical traditions and arguments, act potency distinctions, arguments from composition, Aquinas's De Ente, right? They all converge on the same thing. Of course, it is a dogma of the Catholic Church. So for Catholics, that's has significance there in the ways that Chris explained. And there's many upshots to this. We didn't even talk about morality, of how this offers a nice solution to the famous Euthyphro dilemma. But maybe we could just, I don't know if you want to say anything to that, but we could circle back to that later, because last time I kept you here for 4 hours, which I'll gladly do it again if we get down there. But the explanatory power as well. And that's why I've always kind of liked and leaned into Lonergan, because Lonergan's whole project was just kind of the simple argument that if the whole of reality is intelligible, then God exists. The whole of reality is intelligible, therefore God exists, right? And just the total rejection of bruteness and brute facts. Like, he got that. And that just was so attractive to me as I was working this out, that I came to the point where I'm like, it's divine simplicity or bust, friends. Like that's it for me. And I know people push back on that, but I really was at that position as somebody who was looking from the outside and then eventually made the ascent, right? I didn't start from this position and decide I need to defend it. I got to it and realized that this is the only way that you're going to get that intelligibility that the mind really moves toward and expects. That's the thing. It's sort of the notion of the horizon of intelligibility or being that Lonergan talks about, the dynamism of the mind. Like, it expects those answers to be there, right? Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, the more I've worked on classical theism in general and divine simplicity especially, the more I've come to love the doctrine and see it as an absolutely key, important doctrine in our doctrine of God. There's a reason, right, that this is question number 3 in the prima pars of the Summa Theologiae. Right after the question on God's existence, the first thing Aquinas says about the nature of God, right, is that he's absolutely simple. Mm-hmm. And he gets everything else from that. And I've come to really love the doctrine, and not just on an intellectual level, I think also on a spiritual level. Opponents of the doctrine of divine simplicity often accuse it of making the Christian God too remote from us, incapable of personal relationship with us, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot of that is predicated on misunderstandings about what God has to be like to have a relationship with us. But the more I thought about it, the more I've come to realize, well, look, the kind of relationship I'm ultimately seeking with God is an intellectual one, right? There's a reason only intellectual creatures are capable of beatitude and of going to heaven, because what waits for us there, the kind of relationship that waits for us there, is a deeply intellectual one. I often tell people, as a brief aside, people who claim to, very much dislike school. I'm like, well, but are, devout Christians of one kind or another. I'm like, well, I don't know how much you're going to like heaven then, because it's a very intellectual thing. It's something that only an intellectual creature can appreciate and receive, precisely because what God is offering us in the beatific vision, at least one way of talking about what he's offering us there, right, is ultimate explanation, an end to the thirst for knowledge, right. That constitutes us as intellectual creatures in part, right? There's a reason, right? Man desires to know everything, and what you're getting from God is that kind of ultimate explanation. So if you abandon, I think, classical theism, you end up abandoning the whole project of ultimate explanation. And if you abandon that project, you're abandoning, in a certain sense, the very thing that heaven is offering you. You're abandoning the very thing that beatitude is all about. Now, of course, it's important to note that there's an affective dimension to the beatific vision as well, love, which of course is most important of all. But what we love there, at least insofar as it's received into us, is the knowledge, this knowledge of God, knowledge of what God is like face to face. And part of why we want that is because it offers us the answers to every other question. So I think, actually, contrary to its critics, classical theism, and especially the doctrine of divine simplicity, is ultimately the only way to make sense out of a broadly Catholic spirituality, at least, or any kind of spirituality that talks about the rewards of heaven being one of seeing God face to face, which of course isn't something that happens with our eyes. We can see the humanity of Christ with our eyes, but we can't see the divine essence with our eyes. It's something in the intellect. It's something you have to appreciate intellectually, and what you're appreciating is the answers to, right? I mean, the knowledge of God in himself and the answers that all of that brings. So you kind of and lots of Protestant traditions as well still value that kind of model of what heaven is like. Some don't, right? Some have moved to models of heaven where what's really important about going to heaven is that God's going to give you a big house, lots of cars, maybe, whatever, material goods. Everybody should think that's silly and mistaken. But insofar as you deny divine simplicity, I think you give up on this project of ultimate explanation, which is a project that is ultimately fulfilled in a very spiritual way in the beatific vision. So I actually think the doctrine of divine simplicity supports our spirituality, and enables us to come into better relationship with God, and also to come into a better understanding of what we're seeking in our relationship with God. Why do we want to go to heaven in the first place, right? Is a question that I think too few Christians ask themselves, like, mostly because I guess the alternative, right? People think, well, look, the alternative is really bad, so I don't want to go there, so I want to go to heaven. But I think too few Christians ask themselves the way that they should, well, what is heaven really offering me that I want to go there for? Beyond, like, getting to see all my dead relatives and hug Jesus really hard. That's all really great and important. But most fundamentally, right, that intuitive, immediate vision of God face to face. And why is that valuable? Because it's the fulfillment in me personally of this quest for knowledge of ultimate explanations.
Yeah, and that's beautifully stated. It does echo back a bit to Plato there. Again, he's not into Christian tradition, but he always talked about the realm where you could contemplate the eternal and unchanging forms. When I was first studying Plato, I'm like, wow, heaven is like, it seems heaven for Plato would only be attractive to the philosopher.
Right. Well, so I think that's basically right. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my AC here.
Cool.
And grabbing my charger. Yeah, I mean, that's like I said earlier. I think that's fundamentally right. That heaven for the philosopher is what heaven really is like, and if you can't bring yourself to appreciate that, then I think in some sense you've really embraced the kind of anti-intellectualism that's all too common, especially among Americans, and that I think is antithetical to what God has on offer for us in heaven.
And to our very nature, right? That we are rational animals, or dependent rational animals, if you want to go with McIntyre on that, but at least rational animals, right? And that something of what perfects us is knowledge, right?
That's right.
And so, of course, any thwarting of your own intellectual development is going to be bad for you. And of course, we would expect that heaven has something, at least something, to do with that. I'm glad you brought that up, Chris. I think that's a really relevant and important point.
And one place you see that, I think, too, is the way that people now talk, the very sentimental way in which people talk about their pets going to heaven and stuff like that, which of course is all metaphysically possible. God could bring a dog into heaven and give him all the great things that make dogs happy, in an analogous sense. But he doesn't, right? I mean, obviously that's the Christian tradition, and it's worth asking ourselves, like, well, why doesn't he, right? I mean, what's different about non-intellectual creatures that they don't get included in this plan of ultimate salvation? At least not the same individuals. Maybe there are dogs in heaven, but they are not the dogs that exist here on earth. The dogs that exist here on earth die and never come back.
Here come the comments.
Well, the Thomistic Institute has nice mugs. Your dog's not going to heaven. But the point of, I guess, insisting on that kind of stuff is not because we want to be mean to dogs and exclude them from beatitude. It's because it's this really ultimate positive doctrine in the background about what heaven is about and what's on offer there, right. And what kind of creatures can truly appreciate that kind of thing and which can't. So given their fundamental nature, given their essence, so I mean, right, I think the more I've come to appreciate the doctrine of divine simplicity, the more I've come to understand about it, the more I've come to reflect on it, the more I've appreciated how important it is for not only understanding what God is like, but understanding why God is important to me, and what kind of role God is going to play in my ultimate beatitude, and why I want to go to heaven. And I mean, if that's not something that is promoting my spirituality, I don't know what is.
Yeah, no, that's good, because we do want to get down to the practical. So again, now that we're getting warmed up, we're going to start getting to some of these objections here. One more thing before we talk about modal collapse and God's knowledge and contingent creation with respect to divine simplicity. How important at this point is it to introduce and defend the principle of analogy, of stretch concepts, as Norris Clark used to talk about them? If we don't need to do it now, we can bracket that off. And
I don't think we need to do that now, and I think I know actually where we need to do that, but we don't have to do that for modal collapse.
Then let's go right into modal collapse, because this seems to be, certainly right now, this is something that has come up again in the contemporary philosophical debate around divine simplicity. So why don't you give us the relevant background, Chris, of what we need to know, what this objection is, how it's presented, and what we can do to defend divine simplicity?
Sure. So I first became aware of this objection myself from Facebook, from people who, I think somewhere in the Thomism discussion group. I'm sure that lots of your listeners will be familiar with that group and are in that group, where a certain version of a modal collapse argument was being talked about. And let me say what that version is.
Yeah, real quick. What's just for
Sure.
people, if somebody's made it along this far, you probably know what we're talking about when we say modal collapse. But if somebody doesn't know what that term even means.
Right. Yeah. So part of the commitments of divine simplicity, as I said before, is that there's no distinction there's no composition in God of subject and accidents. And just like with parts, with accidents as well, the scholastics had a broader conception than perhaps we do of properties today, depending on exactly who you ask about properties. But so one of the things they thought was an accident was action, right? So if I run, my running is an accident that inheres in me. That sounds perhaps a little strange at first because we tend to think of accidents as static in some way, right? Like, well, the color of my hair, that's an accident. But running is something I do, right? It's not something that's just that's simply a feature of me. But the scholastic said, no, that's an accident too. It's a certain kind of accident. It's in the category of action. It's something you do, but still it's an action. It's an accident. And then the doctrine of divine simplicity kicks in and says, well, God is identical to his actions. He's not a composite of subject and action. He is his actions. And of course, if God is his actions, that means all of his actions are identical to each other. And therefore, there's really just one divine action. Mm-hmm. There's one thing that God is doing, fundamentally speaking. And so that leads a number of opponents of classical theism to think, well, there's a problem here then with reconciling that with creation, ex nihilo, right? Because if God is identical to his action and God exists necessarily, then it looks like his action exists necessarily. But if his action is one of creation, of creating the universe, or of creating me in particular, or of creating you, or of creating Pluto, whatever the case may be, it seems like all these things exist necessarily. So we can kind of state this formally by saying, premise one, necessarily God exists. Premise two, God is identical to his act of creation. And what's supposed to follow from that is three, therefore necessarily God's act of creation exists, right? Mm-hmm. And you can specify the premises further in order to make absolutely everything necessary, right? You can talk about, you can, instead of just saying God is identical to his act of creation, you could say that God is identical to his act of creation of Christopher, mm-hmm. or of Pat, or of Pluto, or of Aristotle, or whatever you want, right? Thereby making every single fact about the actual world necessary.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That would be obviously bad, not only because it seems obvious that lots of things around us are contingent, but also because as a matter of doctrine, the Catholic Church and most Christians are committed to God's creative choice being a free one, mm-hmm. being one he could have abstained from.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But if he's identical to that action, then it looks like he can't be.
Right. So this impugns on God's freedom, and it collapses. It just wipes out contingency completely. Everything is just shot through with necessity. Right. Mm-hmm.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. So now, I guess what intrigued me about this argument is that both of the premises are definitely true on basically any version of classical theism and Christianity. or any kind of classical theist Abrahamic tradition whatsoever. Right? It's true. Necessarily, God does exist. That premise is true. And on classical theism, it's also true that God is identical to his act of creation. So I think probably one of the reasons that this argument struck me and drew my attention is I'm like, well, the premises are definitely both true on classical theism. So
it better be invalid.
It better be invalid. That's right. And providentially, or as truth requires.
Providentially, yeah.
As truth requires, the argument turns out to be invalid. Mm-hmm. It sounds really good at first, but it turns out to be invalid for reasons that go back to W.V.O. Quine's work. Although I'm sure you can actually find people even before him pointing out the invalidity of this argumentative form. So to see that it's invalid, right? You can just substitute out some terms here, right? Instead of saying necessarily God exists, you can say necessarily 8 is greater than 7. And instead of saying that God is identical to his act of creation, you can say that 8 is identical to the number of the planets, at least ever since we lost Pluto. Mm-hmm. And what would follow from those two premises, if this form is valid, is that necessarily the number of the planets is greater than 7. Right. But that would imply that we couldn't have failed to have had more than 7 planets, and that's obviously false. So that shows that there's something wrong with this argument. That's with the numbers 8 and 9 switched around. That's Quine's own example.
Right, and that's just for people who are students of logic. That's a good, because sometimes it's hard to tell if an argument is valid or invalid. So a good test you can do is just an exercise like that. Can I swap around different terms to gain some conceptual clarity here?
That's right. Now, and I point that out in the paper. I point out, I'm like, look, this argument isn't just invalid, it's famously invalid. We've known that it's invalid since Quine, which is real in philosophical terms, a really long time ago, given the rate of philosophical publication these days over the past, 50 to 60 years. First year graduate students in philosophy, if not before that, would read the kind of works where that I'm talking about, where this argument is shown to be invalid. And what I say in the paper is, look, this illustrates is that formalizing arguments is really important, because this argument sounds super persuasive before you formalize it and look at other substitution instances of it. Right. And I mean, to this day, I encounter people without philosophical training on social media who continue to insist that the argument is valid, or that say that at least my paper has not convinced them that the argument is invalid. And I think there's very few things in philosophy that are obvious and that are decisively done. That this argument is invalid is not controversial. Right. And if you think it is, it's because you lack philosophical training. And everybody who has a PhD in philosophy, I should never say everybody.
Well, yeah, because sadly, my professors had a PhD and had to have me formalize arguments because she did not know how to do that.
Right. Yeah.
So it's amazing you can get a PhD in philosophy and just not know.
I shouldn't say everybody, but
yeah.
But certainly almost everybody with a PhD in philosophy who works in contemporary analytic philosophy agrees that this argument form is invalid. Right. So I'm not even really saying anything earth-shattering or groundbreaking here. I'm just noting that an old mistake has been repeated, essentially. Yes. Yep. This is a rhetorical point I love making, because opponents of classical theism and opponents of Thomism, more specifically, often love to ridicule Thomists on social media by repeating the claim that our response to all their objections is that they haven't read enough Aquinas. And that's often true that few people have read enough Aquinas, even among Thomists. But I guess one of the things that struck me about this argument is that the error is flowing perhaps not so much from having read too little Aquinas as from having read too little of Quine and Kripke, their own, the heroes of contemporary analytic philosophy in some sense.
Right.
In some sense, that's right. But just to drive the point home, and this is again a point I make in the paper, the argument isn't just invalid; it's also not ultimately an argument that relies on divine simplicity per se, right? Because I can read divine simplicity out of the argument altogether, right? The part that's supposed to be relying on divine simplicity is the identification of God with his creative act. And that is in fact a commitment of divine simplicity, but you can restate the argument without saying anything about divine simplicity or without saying anything about anything that classical theists are uniquely committed to, right? So I can say necessarily God exists, premise one. Premise two, God is identical to the creator. And if those are both true and this argument form is valid, then it would follow that necessarily the creator exists. And of course, God can't be a creator without a creation, and we're back into the same kind of conclusion of necessity of everything, right? Especially because I can specify, if I wanted to, God is identical to the creator of X, where X is any contingent thing, and thereby end up making X necessary. Right. So, and note, right, like the identity of God with the creator is not a unique commitment of classical theism. That's a commitment of every Abrahamic faith, that everybody in any Abrahamic faith that believes in God being the creator.
So this, what you're pressing is the idea that this form of the modal collapse argument isn't just, if it were valid, it wouldn't just be a threat of divine simplicity. It would be a threat to theism generally.
Any form of theism in which God is the creator and exists necessarily. Yeah. So maybe Swinburne's out.
Maybe Swinburne's got a shield there. Yeah.
Everybody else is in deep trouble. And I mean, the ability to do that, I mean, more fundamentally, the ability to recast the argument with those alternative premises illustrates that it's what you're appealing to is really not, the argument's not ultimately about divine simplicity. So it's not only invalid, it's not about divine simplicity. It's not an objection to divine simplicity. It's an objection to creation ex nihilo together with God's necessary existence.
Right.
And well, let's see. Let me drive that point home, I guess, a little bit further, and note. Actually, this won't let me share my screen. Are you able to?
I can maybe, let me see if I can give you access to that real quick. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know if I can, unless I make you the host, but I'm not sure if that's going to mess up the recording.
Okay. It's not that important then. I had a little visual aid that would have helped a little bit.
I can certainly put that in the show notes, any visual aids you have. So you can explain it, and then anybody who's listening, if you want to see it, just head over to chroniclesofstrength.com, and I'll just put all the images there and they can follow along. Yep.
Great. So the way the argument tended to develop, so after I kind of, published this first paper and showed that this simple argument doesn't work, both because it's invalid and because it's not really an objection to divine simplicity. The way the argument tended to proceed from there, and I mean, in thinking about it, I saw this myself and other people then saw it as well, was to move to a slightly more sophisticated version of the argument. So this version went like this. Well, look, and this is not formalized, but I'm dealing with a formal version of it in a paper that's going to be forthcoming in an edited volume, hopefully. Well, look, here's something that divine simplicity is committed to. God is intrinsically the same in every possible world. And I know lots of Thomists have misgivings about possible world semantics. I'm not really one of them too much, as long as we realize it's just the semantics. It's not an ontology. It's a convenient way of talking. And I don't think anything rides on it, at least for right now. It's just a convenient way of talking, right?
Got it. Yeah, I'm with you.
God is the same in every, intrinsically indistinguishable across all possible worlds, right? What I mean by that is, given divine simplicity, right? If you compared God in this world with, what God would look like if he had created nothing at all, or if he created a vastly different kind of creation than the one he actually created, you wouldn't be able to tell the gods from those worlds, the gods from those worlds apart from the actual God, right? Given divine simplicity. And I know, again, right, that sounds strange to even talk about comparing what gods from other possible worlds look like. It's just a semantic shortcut.
Right.
Right, if you looked at how God is intrinsically, you wouldn't be able to, he'd be indistinguishable from what he would look like in other possible worlds. And so the idea was like, well, look, if the cause is absolutely the same in every respect, then the effects should be the same in absolutely every respect, right? If we can't distinguish between the causes in two different possible worlds, we shouldn't be able to distinguish between the effects in two different possible worlds. Now, this is, like I said, a more sophisticated version of the argument, not least of all because it now is actually trading on a commitment of divine simplicity that is not shared by those who reject classical theism. Right? They're going to say, no, God, in different possible worlds where God created other things or created nothing at all, God's going to have different.
He's different. Yep. Mm-hmm.
He's going to be intrinsically different. He's going to have different intentions or whatever other accidents they want to posit in God. Mm-hmm. He's going to be different in that way, right?
Yeah.
Intrinsically, and that then you're going to say, well, that's what explains, and that in turn is what explains the effects being different. Mm-hmm. Classical theists can't do that, right? And you just can't. We are committed to God being absolutely the same no matter what he created. And of course, it's worth noting that's not a bug of classical theism. That's a feature, right? We do not want God to look different depending on what his effects are, because that would introduce into God a kind of dependence on his creatures or on his effects. That would be bad. That's kind of that's part of what we're trying to avoid with classical theism in the first place.
Right. That something could be actualizing a potency in God, which is really incoherent when you understand the act potency distinction, right? And that anything that has any actuality whatsoever only can have that actuality because God gives it that actuality. Right. So there's deeper metaphysical reasons of why this would be an issue, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So that's what I mean by saying it's that this indistinguishability of God across possible worlds is a feature of divine simplicity. It's not a bug. It's not some unintended consequence of the view. It's a feature of the view. It's the desideratum of the view.
Right. So yeah, we want to embrace this.
Right. Now, of course, right. It does land us in hot water if the principle it's being married to in this argument, namely that if you have the same cause, you have the same effects, turns out to be true. Fortunately, as I'll hopefully be explaining in this forthcoming chapter, it's not true. And everybody who believes in libertarian free will should reject it, right? Because the whole premise of libertarian free will is that the pre-existent state doesn't determine the future choice, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have me in this world where the moment before I choose to have this interview with you, and the me in the other possible world at that same moment, where I choose not to do this interview, and we're intrinsically the same, because I'm picking out the same moment in both possible worlds. Well, if you would then insisted that the same cause has to produce the same effect, you'd be committed to a kind of determinism. You'd be committed to saying that I couldn't have chosen otherwise, given that I was intrinsically the same in every respect the moment before the choice. So if you believe in any kind of indeterministic causation, you're going to have to reject this kind of principle. But to make the problem worse for this more sophisticated version of the problem, it doesn't even save you from modal collapse if in fact that's what you're trying to avoid by introducing composition into God. And the reason for that, this is where the visual aid comes in. Your listeners should take a look at that now, is because if you think about both models of God, right? On the classical theist model, you have the simple God and his created effects, right? So there's the divine essence, and on classical theism, the divine essence is the whole of God. Mm-hmm. And then you have God's effects flowing from the divine essence, his creatures. In the visual aid, I have red arrows drawn from the divine essence to the creatures. Those are arrows of explanation, right? The divine essence explains why the creatures exist, where they came from. Mm-hmm. Now, let's move over to the theistic personalist or neo-theist picture, where we do admit accidents into God, accidents of believing otherwise than he actually, accidents of belief or accidents of desire or accidents of intention, whatever it is you think is important for God to have in his decision calculus about what to create, right? Mm-hmm. And it's ultimately going to explain why he creates what he creates rather than anything else.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, right, the picture of what God looks like on that version will be a little bit more complicated. You'll have not just the divine essence, but some divine accidents as well, how many and whatever kind you might need. And God is the composition of those things, of the essence together with all the accidents, right? And the idea on that view is that the whole of God, his essence together with all of his accidents, is what ultimately explains why he creates what he creates. It is what explains the creatures. Right. And more importantly, for right now, it gives a contrastive explanation about why you have the particular kinds of creatures in the actual world that you have. So if you ask me, well, why are dogs actual in this world and not unicorns, right? The neo-theist or theistic personalist is going to say, well, because God had an accident in him, right, a desire or intention to create dogs, and no accident of desire or intention to create unicorns. Mm-hmm. And that explains why we live in a dog world rather than a unicorn world. Mm-hmm. What my rejoinder to this, right, is to say, well, look, all you've succeeded in doing is pushing the problem back a step, right? Because now we have to explain where the divine accidents came from.
Right.
And there's only one entity on the neo-theist or theistic personalist metaphysical theory that's ontologically prior to the divine accidents. It's the divine essence. Mm-hmm. It's the only entity in the neighborhood capable of doing the explanatory work of why God has the accidents that he has. And once you see that, you see that the neo-theist or theistic personalist is in exactly the same boat with respect to explaining the divine accidents as the classical theist is with respect to explaining the creatures. Right. So all you've done is push the problem of contrastive explanation, why these creatures rather than any others, back to God himself. Why these divine accidents rather than any others? Right. And this is actually right. I guess you don't want to accept this same cause, therefore same effects principle, because it defeats, for a number of reasons. One, it's incompatible with
libertarian free will.
Mm-hmm. Which you should, at least some people are going to want. Some theists are going to want. Number two, which I haven't mentioned yet, it's empirically inadequate, right? I mean, I think at least some model, it's arguably empirically inadequate, depending on what your interpretation of quantum mechanics is, right? Because depending on what your interpretation of quantum mechanics is, you're going to get violations of this principle on quantum mechanics too. But again, it depends on the interpretation.
Sure.
The real kicker here, though, is that it doesn't get you out of the problem. Right? You're still in the same boat. You've just pushed the problem back from explaining how the divine essence contrastively explains the creatures on classical theism to explaining how the divine essence contrastively explains the divine accidents on neotheism or theistic personalism.
Yeah.
And then the divine essence together with the divine accidents explains the creatures. Fine. Yeah, sure they do. But you have to give me the explanation of the creatures. And so right.
Yeah, no, you finish your thought and then I'll chime in. Mm-hmm.
Right. So not only does it not solve the problem in that way, but now theistic personalism or neotheism faces a theoretical simplicity objection, right? Given that you introduced these accidents to do some kind of explanatory work about creation, but you now have to do that same explanatory work in explaining where they came from in the first place.
Right.
You'd have a simpler theory if you just eliminated the accidents from your theory of what God is like, right? And revert it back to classical theism, because whatever explanation you hope to come up with about how the divine essence contrastively explains the divine accidents, why these divine accidents rather than any others, the classical theist can adopt whatever that reasoning is and just give the same exact story of contrastive explanation about how the divine essence explains why these creatures rather than any others.
Right. So those are three really interesting and good responses. So we have, and to the first one, I think maybe this alone would be enough, because it seems not to the point that if there's a change or a difference in the effect, there must be a difference in the cause. And it seems like there's like maybe a fallacy of accident lurking there, right? Why should we that doesn't seem to be essential to a cause, that it has to undergo change to bring about an effect, right? That just seems like a sort of that inference doesn't seem valid, right? It seems like, finite limited things change, or at least often change, because you brought up quantum mechanics, right? Which seems like we might actually have an empirical counterexample to this. But put that one aside. I think that's worth considering. But just because finite limited things change when they bring about effects, well, why would we extrapolate that when we're talking about something that's qualitatively infinite? And if we already, here's what I would say, if we already have independent reason to think that God is generally an exception to general rules of thumb, why would we think that he wouldn't also be another general exception to this general rule of thumb, right? So for example, most things are caused. God, we've already argued, is uncaused, right? Most things are contingent. God, we've already argued, is necessary, right? So most things, when they bring about effects, change. Well, why would it be a surprise at this point that God might be a relevant and principled exception in this case? Right. I think there's just a clear, I think it'd be a fallacy of accident, right? To just assume just because we see this thing changes when it brings about an effect, and that thing, therefore, everything that brings about an effect must change.
Right. Yeah. So that's absolutely right. This is, I think, another instance of opponents of classical theism writing into their theory of God creaturely assumptions, right? One of which is that when an agent acts, that agent undergoes passion itself, right? So that's a creaturely limitation, right? I can't act without first bringing about some kind of change in myself, or if I act, the thing upon which I act will in turn act upon me, bringing about some kind of change in me, even if it's just, a change of something like momentum or something like that.
Right.
But it belongs to God's perfection as an agent that he's capable of acting without bringing about any change in himself in order to act, or B, being acted upon by the recipient of his action, in turn. And of course, the latter point makes perfect sense, right? If you're adhering to creation ex nihilo, there's nothing to act upon God at the time that he's creating it. It's coming into being as he acts on it. Mm-hmm. It's in virtue of his action that the thing begins to exist. It can't be acting upon him at the same moment. Mm-hmm. In the way that, if I push a chair, the chair pushes back on me in a certain way, right? And not only that, but what's a little bit harder to understand, right? God does not need to bring about any change in himself in order to bring about change in external things, right? So you think about the way that I act, right? In order to bring about an effect in the external world, I first have to maybe change my beliefs, maybe not, but at the very least, I need to form an intention, and my body has to change its position and location and so forth before any kind of effects in the external world can flow. And I mean, it should be, hopefully intuitively obvious how those are imperfections of me qua agent, right? Mm-hmm. So as an agent, it's an imperfection for me to have to change myself in order to change other things. I'd be more perfect as an agent if I could change other things without bringing about any change in myself, mm-hmm. As a means to those external effects. And in fact, that's what we find in God, right? We find perfect agency, that kind of agency that can be exercised without bringing about any change in himself.
Right. So that to me seems a nice response, those collection of arguments. We have a model of libertarian free will, that if you want to accept something like libertarian free will, you can essentially push all change external to God without any intrinsic change in himself, right?
Right.
And that's coherent for sure. I think that's it's been a while since I've read Proust's article, but I think he does something similar in that regard, right? I don't want to put words in his mouth he might not have said. So anyway,
yeah, so most classical theists see that this is a necessary consequence of divine simplicity, that you're going to have to push, you're going to have to make extrinsic to God, or at least partly extrinsic to God, a lot of things that like knowledge or action, a lot of things that are more intrinsic to us. But it's important to note that, right, that although that's weird, right, it's a consequence of our imperfection as agents and as knowers that, and we're going to get into this, I think, in a minute with the next question. It's an imperfection on our part that these things require so much change in us for us to accomplish them, knowledge, action, what have you.
Yeah, no, that's very good. So is there, and I know there's other responses to it, like Stump has her models, Phaser has his response of Cambridge changes and stuff like that. But I guess we can just, if people want, and it's good to have different models and different responses to see that this is, when it comes to something that's admittedly, quite difficult to try and wrap your mind around. Nobody's saying that divine simplicity isn't conceptually difficult. And in fact, it's I think Phaser points this out a lot too, is like, hey, when we're talking about God, we're talking about like the bedrock of reality. Like if it were simple, if it were easy, we should be a little suspicious of that. Like maybe maybe we're not actually like talking about God, right? When we're talking about, perfect being, that which is not wholly other. Norris Clark says, don't call God wholly other, because then we couldn't say anything about him. Call him infinitely higher, right? Yeah. When we talk about that which is infinitely higher, we should expect that it's probably going to get a little, I don't know if spooky is the right word, but strange, quirky, like that, like, and this is in the sciences too. Like things when we start really pushing deep into the sciences do get a little strange, but but we don't say, because it's strange, we don't accept it. No, we say, well, we accept these things and it leads to this thing. And so long as there isn't an obvious contradiction here, we should accept this, right?
Yeah, I made that same point, I think, at the end of my interview with Gavin Kerr on Swan Sona's channel. God is the author of a lot of weird phenomena that we have come to discover via the sciences, right? God is the author of quantum mechanics. God is the author of, the bacterium that causes the Black Plague. Like, why would that exist? Why did we need that in the world? Why is that important? God is, the author of a whole variety of scientifically investigable phenomena that intuitively we wouldn't think that's how the world works, right? But then we do the science and we find out that's how it is. It's weird, right? So when we look at the author of those phenomena, we should expect, like, I don't know why we would be so confident that our antecedent intuitions should be correct there when in God's creatures we're so often surprised by the scientific discoveries about how they work and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's pivot now to another consideration, objection, question, however we want to present it, and that is divine simplicity. But now we have contingent creation, and within that we also have God's knowledge, which we also want to say is unchanging, immutable, eternal. So how do we think about this relationship between God's, and there's other things that are kind of baked into the classical theistic cake that I think are important for this, like eternity, like impassibility. So I don't know if it's even helpful to consider just one, to kind of consider it piecemeal or not, but yeah, anyway, so that seems like another point of possible tension. So what do we do here with creation and knowledge? Mm-hmm.
Right. So if we go back to what I said earlier, I guess, right? I mean, one of the things that we're committed to in virtue of divine simplicity is God's absolute immutability. And not just by immutability, right? We don't mean just that he can't change over time, because he's not in time, he's eternal. But also that he's modally immutable, so to speak, right? He's not just the same across time, he's the same across all possible worlds. So even if you go all the way back to, even if we're talking about from eternity, he's not otherwise than he could not be otherwise than he is. And so, but we also want to say that God knows things, not just about the actual world, but about the actual world at the present time. Mm-hmm. And I am myself a presentist, so I'm particularly committed to God knowing what things are like at the present time, because I think that's what things are like simplicator.
Yes, interesting. I was going to ask you about where you are in philosophy of time, because
right.
Peirce he's an eternalist, right?
He's a very hardcore eternalist. He's not just, I would say a lot of his other philosophical commitments actually flow from his philosophy of time, his eternalism. I think he just fundamentally finds it highly intuitive that time's another dimension along with the three spatial dimensions, and a lot of things just flow from that for him in ways that they don't for me. So yeah,
I'm with you. I'm a presentist. I think it's got the best arguments.
Sure.
So anyways, that's
a
whole other conversation, right? Yeah.
Right. So if God's going to know, like what, is not only what the actual world is like, but what the actual world is like at the present time, then it seems like, again, we have some kind of prima facie conflict, right, between his absolute temporal and modal immutability and his knowledge of the actual world at the present time. Or at least, and this is, going to be what we have to say, we would have a conflict there if we thought that it was necessary for God to have some kind of intrinsic state, that God, if God's knowledge were different, he would be intrinsically different, right? If we were compelled to say that, then we'd have a problem with reconciling that to his temporal and modal immutability.
Yes.
So we better not say that. So we're not going to say that, right? We're going to say instead, right, that God's knowledge of the actual world, God's knowledge of the facts as they are right now, and so on, right, is partially extrinsic. And a heavy emphasis there on partially. It's not that his knowledge is completely extrinsic, that you know, my sitting in South Carolina right now, his knowledge of the fact that I'm in South Carolina right now consists in nothing other than my being in South Carolina right now. Mm-hmm. That's false, right? Because if we had a model of knowledge like that, then non-intellectual things could have that kind of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. If it were completely extrinsic, it wouldn't depend on the nature of the knower in any way. And that would be bad, right? Like we clearly have necessary conditions on what it takes to know anything in the first place. Mm-hmm. That talk about the nature of the knower, right? It has to be an intellectual agent. And so what we want to say is not that God's knowledge that I'm sitting in South Carolina right now is completely extrinsic to him, but that God's knowledge that I'm sitting in South Carolina now, rather than sitting in Texas right now, is completely extrinsic to him, right? It's the contrastive fact. It's the knowledge. It's the contrast that's entirely intrinsic. His knowledge that I'm sitting in South Carolina right now is grounded in two things. One that's intrinsic, namely his intellectual nature. He is an intellect capable of knowing, together with the truth of the matter that I'm sitting in South Carolina right now. Those two facts together, his nature and the facts, collectively ground the fact that he knows that I'm sitting in South Carolina right now.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And what we want to maintain, however, right, is that the intrinsic fact, the intrinsic ground of his knowing that I sit in South Carolina right now wouldn't be any different than if I were sitting in Texas right now, because that would introduce some kind of intrinsic difference into him. We don't want to do that. But we don't have to do that, right? Because if we say that God's knowledge is partly intrinsic and partly extrinsic, there's a little bit of what grounds his knowledge that's intrinsic to him and a little bit that is extrinsic to him, then we can account for the differences, right? Both modal and temporal.
Yes.
Differences across possible worlds and differences across time by just appealing to the differences in the extrinsic facts. Because a little bit of, just any bit of extrinsic grounds for a thing is sufficient to ground differences in that thing if the extrinsic things change.
Yes, right? and that ties well into the model of libertarian free will again, because God could be intrinsically the same, and then it just pushes, like you said, what else is needed for that explanation to external states of affairs, right. External to God, right? Yeah, that's interesting. I like that approach. That's a little bit different than the approach I thought you were going to take. It's certainly compatible with the approach I thought you were going to take, and that is also just understanding that God knows things in virtue of being the cause of those things, right?
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it fits. I was just going to mention that. Yeah. Right. It's the that explanation of what God's knowledge is grounded in, I think, fits very well with Aquinas' doctrine that God's knowledge is the cause of things. Now, and I think it helps to maybe explain why the model has to be that way and why you should want the model to be that way, right? So the way that we're knowers is through receptivity, right? I know what the house across the street looks like because the house across the street acts on me in a certain way. Acts on my sensory organs, which in turn act on my brain, which in turn prepares a certain phantasm for my active intellect to work on, and so on, right? I'm receptive to the facts in the world around me.
Right.
God is not receptive to the facts in the world. The facts in the world are receptive to God, to his causal power. Right. So God knows what the house across the street looks like, not by looking at it or even by contemplating it, so to speak, right, in his mind's eye, but rather by being the cause of it, in much the same way that the architect of the house across the street knew what it looked like before it was even built, in virtue of being the one who had the idea of what it was going to look like and knowing that's how he was going to build it. So there's a directionality of fit, so to speak, to knowledge for creatures that is reversed in God, right? In creatures, we go from world to knower, right? And the world is acting on the knower. In God, it's the other way around. God knows what the world is like, not in virtue of the world acting on him, but in virtue of him acting on the world. So we go from not from world to knower, but from knower to world. And right, given that, right, we should expect that God's knowledge of external things is grounded partly by those things themselves, because God's knowledge of them is his causing of them. So they're very being caused. It constitutes God's knowledge of what they're like.
Right. So that, yeah. No, go ahead. Finish up.
And that in turn explains how he knows them, right? Because you can't cause something to be without knowing that it is and what it's like. Otherwise, you don't know. Like, right? I mean, you don't know what you're doing when you're causing it to be, right?
Right. Yeah. Unless you want to make God really, really dumb, right?
Right. And really, really lucky, right? Like he's very ignorant, but super lucky that like he just happened to create a world, to cause a world to exist that is very intricately and marvelously made.
Yeah. So this ties into, what's the analogy? Just to bring Phaser back up again. Yeah. So he uses the analogy of, like, if you can imagine an author that, kind of thinks an entire novel all at once, right, and is present to that entire novel as any, aspect of it occurs, right?
Yeah.
Just trying to stretch the idea to God's eternity. Then you have something like what we're talking about here. And again, there doesn't have to be any change in God for there to be those Cambridge changes, right? The active creation, or things in relation to God. And I think that's a helpful starting analogy. Now, it breaks down on a couple of levels because, human authors can be dumb. They might have forgot what they wrote at one point.
Right.
But that's because we're physical, we're composite, things like limitations that wouldn't apply to God. So, yeah, like we could maybe not be totally aware of some things that we caused previously because we have cognitive failures, right? But that wouldn't apply to God at all. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Well, here's one way in which I think this intersects with interesting factoid that a lot of your listeners, pop culture factoid that I think a lot of your listeners will be familiar with, is that after the Harry Potter books were written, after they're all written and published, J.K. Rowling, right, made an announcement that, according to her, Dumbledore was gay.
Right.
And my reaction, and I think the reaction of a lot of other people who had read Harry Potter up to that point, was like, no, you can't do that, right? Because it's like the books are constitutive of what's true about the text on the page is constitutive of what's true about Dumbledore. Now, of course, she could write another book and make that be part of the universe or whatever. But you can kind of see a very loose similarity there, right? It's like it's extrinsic to her now, given the authorship. The facts about like whether Dumbledore's gay or not, or any other fact about Dumbledore, it's in the book, and not just in her mind.
That is an interesting tie-in. Mm-hmm.
In her mind anymore. So what that illustrates is that when it comes to things like authorship, when it comes to creative work of this kind, knowledge acquired by creative work, there's a certain kind of way in which the knowledge is being pushed outside of you in such a way that the very external things come to constitute the truth of the matter about what you know.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
And yeah, just one other thing is that, that the Harry Potter books can now go on existing independently of Rowling.
right.
But nothing aside from that is apart from God can go on existing apart from God's creative act here and now. Also, interestingly enough, she's getting all sorts of flack on social right now. She took a stance against the transgender.
Yeah.
She's now fighting against part of the monster that she helped to create. Anyways, we'll circle back to another different conversation, but yeah.
Now, an important possible misconception I want to head off at the start, though, is to know about this God's knowledge being the cause of things, is that it's not universally true about God's knowledge. God's knowledge of himself is not the cause of anything because he doesn't cause himself. I've seen this misconception arise among some people as a reply to the classical theist doctrine that God's knowledge is the cause of things. Well, it can't be, because then God's knowing himself would be causing himself, and God isn't cause. Therefore, that's not the doctrine. The doctrine is not that all of God's knowledge is the cause of what he knows, but that God's knowledge of created things is the cause of the created things. So just to head that off at the pass, that objection won't get anywhere.
Yeah. So, I guess I don't know if we wanted to talk about the principle of analogy at this point. It seems like we're doing pretty well without even having to introduce that. And I guess the less metaphysical.
Well,
I don't want to say baggage we had to bring in, probably the better, but it's, whatever, I think it's also important to note that when we talk about knowledge in God, we don't mean it in exactly the same way as hopefully has been clear as the way that we have knowledge. We say that there's something like our knowledge in God. There's something like our power in God. I think that something like is really critical. And maybe we don't have to unpack it any further than that, but we could if we want, in order to avoid so many of these misconceptions.
It is really critical. And for reasons that go back to not just like reconciling God's knowledge with the contingency of creation, but all the way back to reconciling, God's possession of different attributes with his simplicity, right? We don't say that mercy is justice, or that love, or that love is omniscience in God. What we say is there's something like what we call mercy in God, and that something is identical to something like what we call justice in God, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not that justice is identical to mercy. It's that there's something analogous to both that is one in God.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. I think that's it's so often overlooked, and I think that we can defend the principle of analogy. Actually, Father Norris Clark's, he's got a little book. It's a great little book called The Philosophical Approach to God, and he spends a good amount of time on the principle of analogy there and his response to Kai Nelson. This was written back in the late 70s maybe or something, but it holds up pretty well. I really like that one. If people haven't spent a lot of time on that, I think that's a nice introduction.
Sure, yeah. Father Clark's stuff is great. Mm-hmm. I should also note, and then you can come over and apply this stuff to knowledge as well, right? I mean, if you're like, well, that looks really different from the way that I know things, or that human beings know things in general. It's like, well, yeah, duh, obviously. I mean, if you thought that God was going to know things in exactly the same way that you do, then you just have not really understood what God is and the extent to which God transcends creatures. But it is worth noting, just as a way of relieving this worry to some extent, it's worth noting that all knowledge is extrinsic to some degree, even in us, right? So there's a certain state of mind I have that's intrinsic to me, the belief that I'm sitting in South Carolina right now. But what makes it knowledge, in part, is the fact that I'm sitting in South Carolina right now. Actually, this isn't the best example because it's self-knowledge, but let me choose another one. So like, I know that Trump is the president.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is a certain intrinsic state in me that accounts partially for my knowledge that Trump is president, namely that I believe it and that I have good evidence for it. But that is not all of what makes it knowledge. There's also the truth, right? In order to be knowledge, it has to be true. Mm-hmm. And the truth of the fact that Trump is the president is not intrinsic to me.
Right.
It's extrinsic, okay? And in fact, right, I mean, this is kind of what, I mean, I'm not an epistemologist, so this is just me, shooting from the hip for a moment, but I think this is actually what drives a lot of the Gettier problems that epistemologists run into with defining knowledge is that you have this gap between the intrinsic stuff up here and how the world is out there, and there's nothing that can ultimately guarantee for creatures like us that the intrinsic stuff matches the extrinsic stuff.
Right. But God doesn't have that problem.
God doesn't have that problem because God is the author of the extrinsic stuff. So, but it's worth noting, right? Like, even though I have really good evidence for it, and even though I believe it, I have these intrinsic states of believing it and having really good knowledge for it. It could still turn out that I don't know that Trump is president because for all I know, he died 15 seconds ago, mm-hmm. right? And he's therefore no longer the president. Pence is instead. And so, right, even with creatures, if you're now, it doesn't quite work if you're talking about self-knowledge. So like, because there I'm dealing with knowledge of my own intrinsic stuff, so it'll all be intrinsic. But most knowledge, even for creatures, but that's true of, I should say, that's true of God too. Whatever he knows about himself intrinsically will be totally intrinsic. Right. So he's actually not different from us in that respect. Mm-hmm. But it's worth noting because I think the opponents of classical theism try to make the extrinsicality of God's knowledge sound ridiculous by comparing it with our own, but they have missed the fact that most creaturely knowledge is extrinsic too, because right. If you're talking about knowledge and not just belief, then you're talking about something that essentially includes truth. Mm-hmm. And if it's truth of an extrinsic fact, then that truth is extrinsic, and therefore your knowledge is extrinsic, because extrinsicality is kind of like, right, one drop rule on extrinsicality, right? If you have one drop of extrinsicality, the whole thing is extrinsic in some sense,
right?
Because it depends on something extrinsic. So once you see that, I think it makes it a little bit easier to kind of see, how it is with God. Go ahead.
No, this is really great because again, I think it's important to understand, I guess, how this debate is actually had or how it should be had, right? Like we're at the point where we say, no, we have metaphysical proofs for divine simplicity. So I'm not under an obligation to like tell you how this works exactly in every way, right? All I need to do is swat down your objections, right?
Right. I just have to, and not all the objections, right? Only the objections that claim to show an inconsistency or an incoherency, not just well, it seems really weird.
Yeah, it's mysterious. Yeah, I don't care about the mysterious. That's not an issue. And I want to drive that point because mystery and questions are not objections.
Yeah.
Mysteries and questions are not objections. In fact, if you're a Christian, you have to accept mysteries on some level, right? Like that's just part of the faith. So once we already have this weight that is giving us divine simplicity, all we have to do is just, I think, do what you've just done, is to show like, no, there's a model here that shows that your charge of a contradiction or incoherence actually doesn't go through. And then we're good, right? Then we're safe. And we don't really have to take it any further. Now, we might want to just for the sake of our own curiosity and philosophical inquiry. But I just want to press that because I think that's sometimes overlooked and people will go on to reject not just divine simplicity, but other things about, and not just Catholicism, but Christianity as a whole, just because there is mystery or questions remaining. And I want to say that that's imprudent. That's actually foolish. If we already have independent reason to accept a conclusion, then all we need to do is swat down these objections that make the types of charge Chris is bringing up. And I think that your one with knowledge it successfully does that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, I guess let me recapitulate what I think I just did, right? So there's supposed to be a charge of inconsistency between God's modal and temporal immutability and his knowledge of contingent temporal facts. We get rid of the inconsistency with the partially extrinsic model of divine knowledge. That removes the extrinsicality, and I think any possible incoherence as well. What's left of the objection at that point is, well, it sounds really strange. And yeah, fine. Yeah, it sounds really strange. But number one, that's what's to be expected. And as I hopefully just illustrated with my analogy to human knowledge, extrinsicality is the norm when it comes even to creaturely knowledge. So it shouldn't sound that strange to you. So
right. So it isn't even that strange, right? Mm-hmm.
Right. So that hopefully is going the next step and removing not just the alleged inconsistency or incoherency, but going a step further than I think I need to, than I think we need to, as you pointed out, and drawing a similarity with creatures that helps to aid the understanding.
Right. Beautiful. No, this has been fantastic, Chris. This is really good. So I guess and remind me if I'm missing anything that I said we would talk about, but one of the other things I asked you previous to this interview is what you, and maybe we've already covered it, but so you could just bring up any other point that you think is relevant of what you thought the greatest kind of challenge to divine simplicity is, or maybe in this case was, and what we can do to overcome it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we've talked about it a little bit just by introducing, our theory about how divine willing and divine knowing are going to be partially extrinsic to God. But I think one of the problems that probably hasn't received enough attention so far is how we reconcile divine simplicity with our revealed truths about Christology. So this is something I saw discussed recently on another video by opponents of classical theism, right? And the alleged problem here, right, is, well, it seems like if the second person of God, the divine word, is going to be united hypostatically to a creature, namely his human nature, then this seems to involve some kind of change on his part, or at least a real relation of the second person to his human nature. And you can't have either of those, right? Because you can't have change, because that violates immutability, which violates simplicity. And you can't have a real relation between God and creatures that's real on the part of God, because that would, by divine simplicity, God would be identical to that creation, identical to that relation, and thereby necessitate whatever he's related to in that way. And also introduce a kind of dependence in him on the thing that he's related to. Both of those would be bad. So,
right. The charge is just to re-clarify that divine simplicity is incompatible with the incarnation, for example. Right.
Yeah. Got it. How do we reconcile a simple God to the apparent change on the part of God and real relation on the part of God to his human nature?
Right.
And here, what I think we want to say, right, is that there is no change on the part of the Word, right? That there's change on the part of a creature, namely the human nature of Christ. It comes into being and becomes really related to the Word in a special kind of way, right? Namely in a hypostatic union way. So one thing to note about that, of course, is that in virtue of the real relation on the part of the creature, the human nature of Christ, the hypostatic union is very different than the kind of relation any other creature bears to God, right? A relation of creature to creator, or of redeemed to redeemer, etc., or of saved to savior. Because here we're talking about a relation of personal unity, and not just of creation or salvation or redemption or anything like that, right? The creature in question here, right, the human nature of Christ, is being drawn up into personal unity with the Word without any change on the Word's part, because you can tell this whole story. I mean, the simple way to put it is, you can tell this whole story simply by positing all the changes and all the real relations in the human nature of Christ. And now, that's not to deny any part of Orthodox Christology. We can still say it's still true that the Word became flesh, right? It's just that the Word became flesh in virtue of changes and real relations on the part of a creature, namely the human nature of Christ, and not in virtue of any changes or real relations inhering in the Word.
Right.
So the way that the way that Gavin Carr put this very beautifully recently in an interview I did with him was, he said, the incarnation is not a matter of God moving toward his creatures, but of him drawing his creatures closer to him without any change on his part.
Right.
Right. And so anytime you're talking about something like a union, because that's ultimately what the incarnation is, right? It's a hypostatic union. Union can be achieved by either part of the union, so to speak, coming to the other part, right? It's not required in a union for both parts to move. It's just required for one part to be moved, as long as it's moved into union with the other part. And I think this is important. The solution I've just outlined takes advantages of resources that we've already discussed.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is just sort of a special application of a lot of the principles and resources that we've been trotting out.
But it's important to note. It's important to note because of course, our Christology is very important. So we would want to make sure that the theory does apply faithfully to our Christology,
especially as Catholics.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if we ran into any problems with the Christology, that would be a really bad sign for, the doctrine of divine simplicity. Fortunately, we don't, right? I mean, we can tell the full incarnation story without ever positing any change on the part of God or any real relation in him. And we thereby preserve all the Orthodox statements, right? We say truthfully, the Word became flesh. And we don't reduce the hypostatic union to a relation similar to the one that every other creature bears to God. It's like, no, right? We can just say that this is a special relation that this particular creature, the human nature of Christ, bears to the Word, very different from the kind of relation that every other creature bears to him. And that accounts for, why the incarnation is unique among the real relations that creatures bear to God, and why, here we can actually say there's two natures united in one person. And it's, I guess, one way of hammering this point home by way of, one way of hammering this point home is to note that there's going to be things even the neo-theist or theistic personalist wants to say about Christ that they're not going to want to explain in virtue of his divine nature, right? We say things like Christ died. Okay, well, that's not true in virtue of his divine nature, right? Nothing about his divine nature died on the cross. We want to explain that entirely in terms of his human nature. We say Christ wept. That's not true in virtue of his divine nature. It's true entirely of his human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be lots of other predications we make of Jesus Christ solely in virtue of his human nature, regardless of whether classical theism is true, right? Just Orthodox Christology requires that we not make every true predication of Christ true in virtue of his divine nature, right? There's going to be some true predications of Christ that are true solely in virtue of his human nature. But if that's okay, right? If it's okay to make some predication, if it's okay to make predications of Christ solely in virtue of his human nature, then it's certainly okay to make the incarnation itself true in virtue solely in virtue of changes that are happening on the part of his human nature, or of real relations that are inhering only in his human nature. So it's not as if classical theists are doing something that is alien to the Christological tradition in saying that there are some things that are true of Christ only in virtue of things that are happening on to his human nature.
Yeah, this is something that you tend to be especially good at, Chris, of showing that, okay, if you want to make this objection or this assumption, be careful, because it might come back to get you when you're not expecting it. And I think that's always good to show. Now, that itself isn't always enough to refute the objection, and I think you've done that independently for each of these cases, but it is relevant to show, if somebody's trying to prove something, they don't want to prove too much, right? You're not going to want to prove too much. And I think you've done a nice job of both swatting down the objections, but showing, hey, even if these objections went through, you yourself should be worried about them, because you yourself wouldn't be free and clear of the implications of this objection. I think it's just a good sort of,
I think a lot of that flows from what I had said toward the beginning of our talk, namely that a lot of what we find in natural theology in the classical theist tradition confirms what the revelation shows us, right? Oftentimes, right, we have certain things that classical theism it forces us to say about God, and theistic personalists or neo-theists want to object to that. They don't like that. But it turns out that the Christian revelation commits them to saying very similar things themselves. So we saw that, with the modal collapse thing, they wanted to object to God being identical to his act of creation because that seems to lead to a modal collapse. But it turns out Christian revelation already commits them to saying that God's identical to the creator. Or here, right, I mean, they want to say that they find it very weird or very odd that the incarnation could be accomplished solely in virtue of changes brought about in the human nature of Christ, or of real relations inhering in the human nature of Christ. But it turns out that the revelation itself requires them to say that certain Christological predications are true solely in virtue of Christ's human nature. For example, right, I mean, obviously something that trips Protestants up all the time, right, that Christ has a mother is true solely in virtue of his human nature. So when we say, now of course Christ is God, so we say that Mary is the mother of God. But when we say that Mary is the mother of God, we're saying something that's true of Christ solely in virtue of his human nature. And that's why nobody should object to it, right? I mean, it doesn't, because it's not true in virtue of the divine nature in any way, shape, or form.
Right, but it's still one person.
Right. Because of the personal unity, the predication ends up being true of God. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, awesome. Way to tie it all together. That's really great, Chris. So we've covered a ton of territory. If you made it to the end of this conversation, you are invested, my friend. So I hope that this has been enlightening. It certainly has been for me. This has been really good stuff, Chris. I mean, divine simplicity, this debate is kind of at the deep end of the swimming pool in a lot of philosophy of religion. So I really appreciate you taking the time here to kind of step us through this.
Happy to do it.
Yeah. Any final thoughts you have? And then otherwise, let the listeners and watchers know, if they're on YouTube, where they can access your work, follow the stuff that you're doing, any and all that good stuff. Yep.
Good. Yeah. So I guess I wanted to just recapitulate, like, okay, why you want divine simplicity. You know, we dealt with some of the objections here, I hope, but just to reiterate, right, we want divine simplicity because we want a full explanation of reality that has no brute facts, right? Mm-hmm. Because ultimately explanation is kind of an all or nothing matter, right? You can't put some kind of brute fact at the head of your explanatory chain and get real explanations downstream.
Right.
But also because, you know, we don't want to put any kind of bruteness at the beginning of our system, because it enables the naturalist, the atheist, to put a natural brute fact at the head of their theory, mm-hmm. And leaves us without any kind of basis on which to charge them with incoherence on the basis of doing that. And then also because, as I hopefully implicitly came out in our talk about modal collapse, the doctrine of divine simplicity makes for a theoretically simpler theory of God, right? So the doctrine of divine simplicity leads to theoretical simplicity, because it turns out that by positing accidents in God, the way that theistic personalists or neo-theists often want to do, doesn't really gain you any theoretical advantage. You drop into this same kind of problem of needing to offer contrastive explanations about why these accidents, and your only tool is the divine essence. You can do that same kind of explanatory work to whatever extent it can be done by just talking about the divine essence and creatures. Mm-hmm. So you have as much explanatory power with fewer positive entities on classical theism. So classical theism is the theoretically simpler theory, and that's another reason to adopt it. Yeah, so I mean, there's other reasons, but we didn't really cover enough ground earlier. We didn't really set that up earlier in the interview, so I'll leave that be for now.
Well, I would love to continue this conversation at some point, Chris. So if anybody else has any questions or objections to divine simplicity, Chris will always be happy to come in and swat those down for us. I'm sure.
As for where to find my work, my published work can be found at my website, which is firstphilosophy.net. I've done a number of these YouTube interviews and other podcasts at this point, so you can probably also find stuff like that by just searching my rather unique name in YouTube, or even just Google for the.
Let me quickly mention the one you did with our friend John DeBrosa recently on divine simplicity and the Trinity, which is obviously relevant. I will link that in the show notes so people can listen to that as well.
Thanks. That's great. And then I also have a blog that's very inactive. It's really just a way for me to journal my own paper ideas, which is matterofargument.blogspot.com.
Beautiful. I will link all that in the show notes. Christopher Tomaszewski, thank you so much for the awesome conversation. Really appreciate it, my friend.
Thank you, Pat. It was a pleasure.